Okay, good evening, class. This is Vincent Zhang from EPD. Today I'm being invited by your professor to give you a talk about the sharing of Hong Kong, how we derive our policy in terms of the climate change policy. Let me give you a brief introduction of myself first. I work in EPD in climate change policy before 2013. So at that time, if I'm still in that position, I cannot teach because I can't share how we make policies at the time when I make policy. So after I left the position, Professor Tao Wong, who is my supervisor of my PhD, invited me to come back to PolyU to give the sharing about Hong Kong as a case study, how we respond to climate change in terms of all the work we have done. And actually, I was a PolyU graduate studying here for my bachelor, for my MPhil, and for my PhD, working in atmospheric science, and then I entered EPD, working in various policies in terms of the indoor air quality, in terms of the climate change, and then I moved on to the environmental assessment team, working on EIA vetting process as the authority to approve EIAs. And now I work in the air science and modeling team, responsible for the Hong Kong air quality monitoring network, which you see 18 air quality monitoring stations, measuring the CO, ozone, SO2 NOx, and PM10, PM2.5, giving you the information about the AQHI that you can see from the app from your phones. And I also work on the VOC monitoring network, transferred to my team since 2022, which is a new network. So we have two networks combined into one under my management. Today I'm quite delighted to come back again since for more than 10 years to share with students on how we make policies by looking at the information that you may have already learned from various lessons from the internet or various media. So my online presentation will cover the following parts. The first one is why we need to respond to climate change. So the second is why there's an international framework in combating climate change. The third one is Hong Kong's climate change policy, and then the rest will be the Q&As. So before I start talking about policy, I always talk about why we have to come up with a policy, why we don't have a legislation. I make legislations. I make the legislative amendments in terms of our the laws in Hong Kong. I make ordinance. I make policies. For policies and legislations, the major difference is that legislations has to come up with a written benchmark or clear black and white guidelines in how you enforce. But for policies, it's a kind of government position that you can say you deal with something, or you can say you have another position next day that you don't deal with something because of the blah 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 various kinds of considerations. Policies can change much faster, and also policy sometimes we need to drive something to make it move before we come up with some kind of benchmarks, guidelines, limits, or actions required for you to do something, and then put it into a legislation. But for climate change, how can we say I force you to drive EV or I force you to use renewable energy? There's no such kind of framework possible to set it as a legislation. So we come up with policies to drive the move rather than mandatorily forcing you to do something or force the concerned parties to do something. So that's the major difference between having a kind of government policies versus a government legislation. So why we need to respond to climate change is a kind of, at least you have to get that background in your mind, in your boss's mind, why we have to do something, why we have to look into something that put into our desktop or draw our boss's attention. So we know the evolving climate change science. We know there will be political and economical implications. We know the science is evolving, so we need to take into account of those changes. And when asked by the public or the scientists, we need to have a position to understand, address, or look into the issues. For political and economical implications, you look into this thing as a kind of negotiation, discussions on the table or under the table. What are the different parties concerned? Discuss this kind of climate change things. We need to look into the economics. If we put in money to drive mitigations by cutting emissions, would there be any benefit or disbenefit from driving this kind of emission cuts? And also we need to look into the economics of adaptations. Because if you don't adapt, there will be floodings or catastrophic severe rainstorm, typhoons damaging your properties. Would there be a kind of loss to the properties of the public? Where there will be more severe loss if you don't do something. So we need to consider these kinds of needs to put on the table. And how much effort we put into addressing these kind of things will depend on the government allocation of resources. So this is such a kind of general understanding why we can't just ignore the climate change issue. So I think you have learned these a lot, just why we have to address climate change is a global challenge. We need to look into the definitions, why we have to look into global warming because of the gradual rise in temperature due to greenhouse effects. We need to look into the results increase in CO2 concentrations. By looking into the results of such increase, that means you need to measure it, find the concentrations around you. So this kind of information we have to gather, even from a government's perspective. We look into climate change and found the authoritative definitions from UNFCCC. So you see that there's a change of climate attributed directly or indirectly to human activities. That must be some kind of human activities. Otherwise, you don't put too much effort or focus on the natural changes. So you need to focus on the human activities or anthropogenically introduced or induced changes to the climate system. And then after looking into these kind of definitions or concerns, we look into the observed climate changes from, say, the observatory, looking into various kinds of temperature rise trends. We have these kinds of observations from the sea level rise, rainfall records, and also the rainfall over years. So these are kind of information that we put as the basis for we look into this climate change issue. From the other observations, such as more frequent extreme weather events causing floodings, causing damage to our buildings, these are pretty obvious. We have to deal with these issues because even if we put it down in a low profile, it occurs every year, and it occurs more frequently in the coming years. So we would be under a great pressure if we don't do something to deal with it. Or we understand that even if we do something about it, Hong Kong is so small, even if we cut all the emissions in Hong Kong, you still can't mitigate all the climate changes that may occur in the future. but we have to do something as a part of the global citizen. And we have to gauge what are the impacts of these climate changes, even if these impacts have been derived, analyzed by various parties or scientists. So we need to look into these impacts from both sides. One thing is that the negative impacts would be, say, the degraded environment due to landslide, that kind of thing. We may introduce, there will be impacts on the human and economic losses, damages. There may be affecting everywhere because of the extreme weather events. We stop everything in Hong Kong because of the typhoon upcoming, or more severe typhoons causing more damage to our environment. There may be rising costs of the living because of the increasing temperature. We need more air conditioning, and that results in more increase in electricity consumptions. There may be infectious disease depending on the situation of the temperature profile or that kind of environmental conditions. So we need to look into these negative impacts. But of course, there will be some kind of positive impacts introduced by climate change, such as new jobs. The most current issues would be carbon auditing jobs, ESG jobs, green financing jobs. These are new jobs. They are increasingly popular. There will be saving money by, say, lowering the heating requirements in winter because of the increase in temperature. That's a simple kind of example that you may easily understand. There may be better sharing of resources, like we roll out various environmental solutions. And because of climate change is a hot topic, people will be more aware of the efforts that we have to put in, the resources we have to put in to, say, recycle waste, reducing the use of plastic, that kind of thing. Would draw more attention of the public to deal with this issue. And also for the ecosystem, they may be healthier because of the change in the environment. We don't know. We need to look into these issues. And also there would be more stakeholder collaboration or engagements because climate environmental protection issue is quite easy to understand and more willing to be accepted to a kind of personal or global responsibility to draw the attention of the public to come up and speak and share together. And also there would be a chance to have smarter, greener, and healthier buildings, greener, more beautiful cities, shorter commuting time. This is kind of one of the major drivers, but climate change is only one of them. Just has a kind of topic to attract the attention of, say, the building engineers, the designers, how they put climate change as one of the many elements into their consideration of designing greener buildings, designing more energy efficient appliances, that kind of topics. Because if you don't do it because of the competition, you may not be able to bid for new jobs, bid for new tenders, new services, or new projects. So this is kind of drivers. And also we talk about the ESG thing, the green finance, the green bonds. So if you have a topic of showing that you need to pay some kind of attention and responsibility for addressing climate change, it would be more easier through these ESG, green finance, green bonds to sell the message to you, to convey the message to you that you are contributing, no matter how small that part it is. So apart from these impacts, we also look into the projections because if there would be improving environment in the future, there's no need to do so much more, putting so much resources into addressing that kind of problem. But if you see that the projected climate change say there will be rising annual mean temperature, there will be increasing intensity and variability in rainfall. That means the impacts, no matter how positive or negative it is, it will be more intensified. And also for the rising annual mean sea level, because Hong Kong is a coastal city, so you need to address this problem more, get more prepared, because we are just at the coast. So the Works Bureau, Development Bureau, Building-Related Policy Bureau must cater for this kind of change to prevent any future catastrophic damages to our Hong Kong's property or buildings or developments. So after looking into these kind of general assessment of the impacts, positive or negative impacts, existing observed changes, projected future changes, we ourselves as the government has several reasons for taking actions to combat climate change as we showcase our responsibility in responding to these changes. So the first thing is that we have the responsibility to bear the fundamental as an emitter. No matter how small we emit, from just the power plants, from just vehicles, we still emit. So we have the responsibility as an emitter to take care of this. We understand the extreme weather conditions will have more significant changes or intensify in the future, and these impacts would cause the society, economy, and daily life a cost. So we have to carry out mitigation measures and promote public awareness to reduce our carbon emissions. So that's the urgency. And we see that the low carbon economy is a kind of driver in the global economic development. So we want to take this opportunity to drive green economic development. And also because if you don't do anything, there are other places doing same or much better than you. You will reduce our competitiveness. So we have to enhance our business and industrial sectors' competitiveness through their energy conservation and other low carbon strategies. Or like the financial sectors having this in mind, they would be more competitive in driving the attention of the global investors to invest in Hong Kong's, say, green bonds or green economy. And also we have to think about positioning ourselves as a vital role in transforming the region into a quality living area, with Hong Kong being the greenest city of China at the time. So Hong Kong is always taken as example from the mainland that we have to do better because we are more developed and we are the window to the world, showcasing how we perform as compared to others. So at that time, we also positioned that because more than 10 years ago, Hong Kong developed for the climate change policies could be quite rapid and upfront. So we want to showcase to other provinces in the mainland that we are doing so good and share our examples and experience to other provinces in the mainland. So because of that, to drive this kind of government actions, we normally escalate to the chief executives and see if this is kind of important issues or a focused issue under the CE's policy agenda. And since in policy address 2013, we see two words, that's low carbon. So small, just two words. And then after a few years, we see in 2017, we see the Interdepartmental Committee chaired by the Chief Secretary for Administration. So we see the importance of this issue, that the government would like this thing to be managed by the top officials, the Chief Secretary, and then commit a target by reducing the carbon intensity in Hong Kong from the 2005 level by 65% to 70% by 2030. So commit something means there is some kind of detailed, convincing assessment put into the top levels for them to assess if that's achievable, how that could be achieved, what are those parties or bureaus or departments to be involved. So after I left the position, there must be some kind of internal in-house assessments on how we take forward the climate change issue and what are the possible commitments that we could roll out. And also we see that there would be kind of a working group on infrastructures under climate change. So you see the infrastructure working group on infrastructures, that means the development parties, like the development bureaus or buildings related policy bureaus, and the executive arms like the architectural services department, buildings department must come on stage, because EPD is not a party having the expertise for infrastructure planning. So there must be some kind of these infrastructure related professionals or officers to come on stage and discuss, agree, and roll out something under that working group, rather than I don't think you would expect a government working group to just discuss without anything coming out. So if that's put in the policy address, that means something concrete outcomes will be checked by the top officials regularly and periodically, and chase for updates and returns. So, and also the last one is the cleaner energy by 2030. That means something has to be planned from 2017, so that the real thing occurs in 2030. So there's a kind of long-term future commitments at that time. And in the next year's policy address 2018, you see that there would be a long-term decarbonization strategies up to 2050. That means you are having a longer assessment for the further future in 2050, how we decarbonize, how to introduce renewable energy in a more systematic manner. That means how we not just say it by implementing renewable energy facilities or installations in Hong Kong. And also we have the feed-in tariff. We see there are so much more details. The PV system, the photovoltaic systems, and also the green building certifications. All these are real things to be checked, update, chasing for your returns, outcomes. So that would be starting from a low carbon 2 words up to so many details in the kind of programs or plans or implementation to be rolled out in the very short term, because policy address won't allow you to say, I spent 5 years waiting for the assessments. So you need to have a kind of more concrete plans once you put in the policy address. So in 2020, we quote Professor Xi's steer that we have to achieve, because we have to achieve peak of carbon emissions in 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. So Hong Kong SA government must commit something equal to or better than this kind of target. It's always most of the cases. So you can, even if you do on par, the same level, Hong Kong means something you're not doing very good. So we commit 10 years earlier, 2050, for carbon neutrality. So if we commit that target, what are those measures, strategies? So you will have to update your climate action plan. So, so apart from those science observations, projections, you see the political pressure, commitments. Okay. So in 2021, we see the climate action plan 2050 comes out. Okay. We see reduced carbon emissions by 50 before 2035 versus the level 2005. That means you have more detailed assessment on your emissions observed in the past and the projections in the future. And what are those scenarios? What kind of measures you have to put in place? What are those significant emission cuts possible? And what are the possible achievements? Not to commit by 65% or something, my 50. So it's how we professional officers have to work out these kind of assessments. Criticized by bosses, how you stand for those emissions possible. And what are those scenarios? Would they be committed by, say, the energy team? Or if they don't do it, what would be the reasons or the results of these emission cuts? We set up the Office of Climate Change and Carbon Neutrality under the EEB, Environment and Ecology Bureau, so that we keep track and drive the changes that we have committed. So we have set up the office, we have dedicated advisory committees so that we keep track of every party involved and how they work on these kind of commitments, hurdles, progress, and results. So all these kind of things are within the government's infrastructure, how we take forward this kind of climate change issues. It's not a kind of science discussion. We talk about the actual implementation or planned, proposed implementations. And look, keep track of the changes. If that's going way faster than expected or going way below the schedule, we keep track of everything. And also, we call the net zero carbon emissions for electricity generations. So once we say these few words, you have to assess whether you have this kind of sources, how you can tap into that resources, how long it takes to link into that resources, and what are the maximum possible resources guaranteed for not 5 years, 10 years, is for the future. Could you guarantee that you can go for net zero carbon emissions for electricity generations for 10 years, 20 years? How would you deal with that? What are those changes needed for the electricity generation part? If you don't have the power plants committed to do it, what would you do? If they can commit it, but they are far behind the schedule, what would you do? If they commit and on schedule, but can't get the renewable sources they want to generate net zero carbon emissions, what would you do? So all these kind of questions you have to address well before the policy address rolls out at that time. So, and also we have zero carbon emissions from the transport sector, from the waste management. So in 2023, it's quite similar because of the dual carbon targets. Because we've committed target, we updated on what else we have to do, achieve carbon neutrality before 2050, reduce carbon emissions by 50%. All these are very similar. So we have more concrete or detailed proposal by looking into the enhancing energy conservation and decarbonizations in buildings. We have more concrete focused actions after a year or two. We extend the recovery and recycling schemes to more products, establishment, post-show, wetland, all these kinds of proposals from the start to put into more details on those concrete proposals as developed by the relevant parties or departments or policy bureaus. And in this year's policy address, I haven't come up with that slides. I see that it's quite similar. It's to promote a green and low carbon lifestyle by continuing to promote waste recycling and reduction and recycling. So we address the waste issue, again, putting under the climate change umbrella. We speed up the green transformation of manufacturing production. It's a bit not quite similar to this by rolling out green technologies to the mainland, to those Hong Kong-owned companies or manufacturing processes within China. So it's a bit out of the discussions within Hong Kong's territory by pushing carbon emissions across the border. It's a little bit out of the Hong Kong's that time. It's out of my understanding why they have to put it out by putting money investment in the Hong Kong-owned companies for greener production. That's what I understand. And also continue to promote ecological conservation and also expand the charging network for EVs. So it's quite easy to understand for the promotion of waste reduction and recycling. It's easy to understand the expansion of the charging network. But for other things, they may have come up with various discussions to come up with new ideas or new proposals. I don't know. But it's a kind of thinking process that they have brought these kind of things, and I will elaborate so much more later in the slides. So the first thing is that the policy address means some kind of government's commitment. So after apart from the commitment, why there is an international framework in combating climate change? It's outside Hong Kong. It's a kind of binding of various countries to address this issue because climate change affects everyone. Unlike air pollution that I monitor, I know the source, I know the control. For climate change, even I monitor the greenhouse gas, I control greenhouse gas, you still experience climate change. So you need every parties around the world, in the globe, to come up and work together. So unlike, it's not related to your water pollution or waste pollution that would be more confined in your territory. Climate change is needs intergovernmental efforts. You can't do it on your own. So at that time, you have the UNFCCC to bind every parties together to draw invite them to come to discuss this thing. But because of the obligations of different parties or interests or resources or priorities are different, you need to have a kind of, you can say, the linkage or coverage to need them to show their global responsibility, I would say. But the other side of the story is that it's a kind of foreign affairs that you have to fight against each other on the resources to be allocated, the responsibilities to be bared by individual parties. So at that time, we learned from the top officials in the mainland how we, because of this kind of commitment or negotiations, it's not Hong Kong's own actions. It's a kind of foreign affairs how we deal with climate change issue. So we have put that in mind in developing our policies. So apart from the international framework, UNFCCC, at that time we also have the Kyoto Protocol that was ratified at the time when I worked on this policy. It's the first of the implemented agreement around the world. And at that time, the setup is quite interesting that they have certain kind of demarcation, I would say. They have annexation parties that are, we call that more developed countries. They have to set their internationally binding emission targets. And also because you set certain parties to have commitments, there must be some parties that do not have such kind of commitment. So they are working on a principle. We call it CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility at that time. So this kind of demarcation, as well as the differential treatment on different parties in their responsibilities, was agreed or proposed at the time and ratified. So developed countries have commitments because they emit more in the historical time up to the stage of their development. But for those developing countries, they are still having their process or progressing through their development. So they are not going to commit their targets. So this kind of difference nowadays is not that easy to get this kind of commitment now, because no matter how you say you're developing countries, you're still forced to commit something in addressing climate change. But at that time, developed countries take the lead because they emit more. Developing countries should actively adopt measures to adapt to and mitigate climate change because they are more having less resources, more vulnerable to the climate change introduced or induced by those developed countries at that time when they emit so much more in the atmosphere. So China, at that time, as one of the non-annexation parties, sticks to this principle and did not commit any target. But there's no such obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that sparked controversy in international negotiations at that time, given that China has become the world's major emitter because most of the manufacturing processes were put into the mainland. So again, non-annexation parties, there's no greenhouse gas emission limits for them at that time. But we are required, Hong Kong being part of China, required to submit the national communications. That means you document your emissions. You document your national circumstances or stage of development, your various things in the environment, your greenhouse gas inventories. That means your inventories of emissions of the greenhouse gases, your measures to facilitate adequate adaptations to climate change. That means how you adapt to the anticipated climate change, your measures to mitigate climate change, cutting emissions, and what are your constraints and gaps and related financial, technical, and capacity needs. So at that time, you're seeing that developed countries are helping the developing countries in addressing climate change, while the developing countries has to show what are your emissions, what are your measures, what are your constraints and gaps to showcase your national communications and put in your information in a public platform for vetting by various parties. And also, there are various Kyoto mechanisms at that time, just to facilitate, apart from joining parties to come together by the UNFCCC, you have the Kyoto Protocol to join into the emission binding targets and the differential treatments for various developed and developing countries. There are also Kyoto mechanisms just to drive or stimulate green investment at that time, and help parties to meet their obligations, because the annexation parties have their targets, and if they can't meet the target, what would be possible to help them to meet these targets? So there are three mechanisms at that time. That's the international emissions trading. That means one sell the credits while the others buying the one. The clean development mechanisms is to having these developed countries having projects in a developing countries, cutting the emissions and use that offset in emissions as a kind of emission cuts for meeting their obligations. And joint implementations is having two developed countries working in one project together and shared emission cuts. So all these are just to facilitate the developing countries or developed countries and developing countries for technology transfer, emission cuts, while at the same time meeting the obligations. So how could we monitor after we have this kind of mechanism? How could we know, just like your money put into the bank, how could you check? So there's a kind of monitoring mechanisms. How could you monitor those annexation parties are in compliance with the emission targets that they have been tasked to do it? So we call it the MRV framework, the measurement, reporting, and verification framework. That means you have some kind of, just like the accreditation system, the HOCRIS system, that kind of things. You have third parties to check your emissions, verify your emissions, or report your emissions. The MRV framework, just a simple independent check of your transactions of emissions. So after all this kind of emission cuts or technology development, another aspect that was quite new at that time was the adaptation, because we knew that climate must be changing and changing so fast. We need to adapt to the climate risk. So how could we manage these climate risks is to assist various countries, no matter how much resources they have to put in, the climate is changing. How could they cope with these changes without causing too much damage to their properties, to their people? And we know that the most assistance needed would be those developing and least developed countries. We had very good aspirations that we want the developed countries to help them, putting in the resources, improving their resilience by enhancing their adaptive capacity while facilitating the development and deployment of technologies. And we also ask for funding for these kind of adaptations because those developing or least developed countries may not have that kind of money for such investment. So we look into the Kyoto mechanism during that time. We know the mechanisms, Kyoto mechanisms. We know the CDM framework because Hong Kong is part of China. We have having the non-annexation parties. We can't join the joint implementation. We can't join the international emission trading. We must be able to fit into the part on CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. We follow those kinds of commitments by the mainland as the home country. We follow these kind of discussions and follow-ups, the Bali Roadmap, the Copenhagen Accord, the Cancun Agreement, Dubai Platform on Enhanced Actions, Doha Amendment, Paris Agreement, all these kind of things. We have to look into all the details and what would be the implications for Hong Kong if we need to change anything in terms of our climate change policies that we have developed or proposed. What are the follow-up? Boss would ask, what are the implications? If that agreement is entered into force, what would be our follow-up actions? We have to keep in view of all these international developments. And we have to look into the details on what are those calls, such as the Paris Agreement. We see that there's a goal of keeping the temperature of 1.5 degrees. What's our will? What's our position? What are the contributions before and during the countries submit the comprehensive national climate action plans? So what are our plans? How would that be changed after this kind of agreement enter into force? What are our preparations? So these are the policy officers' job to look into the details while advising your bosses on the actions or follow-up required. We see the ambitions, transparency, solidity, all these kind of details in these kind of agreements. You have to look into every detail. Once being asked by the press, by the public, you have to come up with a proposed answer. So we have to look into keep track of the international arena of these kind of development in terms of the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and all those agreements and follow-up actions in the international negotiations. And also we have to look back into the mainlands. At that time, we see China's nationally determined actions by 2030. We see they have proposed that they will achieve peaking of CO2 by around 2030 and lower their CO2 emissions per GDP by 60 to 65%, increase the share of non-fossil fuels in the primary energy consumptions around 20%, increase forest stock volume by around 4.5 billion meter cube on the 2005 level. The fourth one is unrelated to Hong Kong because we don't have forest stock, but the first 1, 2, 3 items cause a great impact for the Hong Kong's policy development because there's such kind of commitment. So after all these Paris Agreement, there are also a kind of obligations for China. So we have to help fulfill these kind of obligations by, say, develop this plan as scheduled. So these are the constraint for the policy officers to come up with plans, developments, staged, scheduled development for the government to address the climate change issue. So apart from this international thing, you also see that the UN has an IPCC, which is the leading international body for assessment of this climate change. You see it was formed by UNEP and the WMO, World Meteorological Organization, in 1989, won the Nobel Prize. But the key thing is that it has the IPCC assessment reports that we have to read the assessment. So apart from those things I've talked that we have to keep track of those changes, we also need to look into the assessment reports, see the various update of the assessment, and draw the information from the assessment report and how we transform that into our policy. So many things to look into. So in the latest 6th assessment report, you have the different working groups working on the physical science basis, the impact adaptations and vulnerability, and also the mitigation of climate changes, covering the various aspects that I have talked about later. So you have the science, you have the adaptation, and also you have the mitigations. And why we have to look into the IPCC is that it's a kind of agreed consensus of the scientific communities, how they look into the climate change issue. And we draw that as a reference. It will be much easier than we develop our own scientific basis to come up with, say, adaptations or mitigations, because you have an international scientific body to help you, and you adapt those relevant to your party or to Hong Kong, and draw that into your policy or mitigation measures or proposal or plans. So at that time, we see the major findings as a human influence is reconfirmed again. We see unprecedented changes. We see the attributions to human influence. There's a kind of opening remarks for all these kind of climate changes policy development. And also we see the changes in temperature. We see the deep reduction required to maintain or minimize the potential global warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees. And also we see the global water cycle, which is not being seriously considered in most of the time because we are having water imported from the Dongjiang. So that would be most likely we would rely on the water supplies department to take care of the water management in Hong Kong. Another scientific aspect of the IPCC assessment report is that we look into the projected impacts, say the surface temperature change relative to 1850 to 1990, 1900. We see the changes and the projections are coming. And we see the global mean sea level change from the IPCC report again here. So after you see into this kind of setup, the setup of the framework, discussion, your position within China, your position around the world, your potential commitment, mainland's commitment, all these kind of things that I have taught in the past, put everything into your considerations surrounding Hong Kong. This part will come to how we derive the Hong Kong's climate change policy. So the first thing is that under UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol at that time, we understand that the mainland is not required to meet any target. So as under these considerations, we cannot meet any. We do not have any kind of target, because you can't say the mainland doesn't have to meet any target, but Hong Kong comes out and say I have to meet some target. That's impossible, because I've slightly mentioned that it's a kind of foreign affairs, that countries are having this kind of negotiations and discussions, and you can't Hong Kong being just a part of a country and come up with something different. The CBD are the common but differentiated responsibility. We don't have quantitative reduction target. We have to prepare the submission for national communications as part of the obligations. So we prepare that. We see the release of climate change scientific findings from the various assessment reports, the AR4, AR5, AR6, and upcoming AR7. We see the mainland's target in 2009 for the carbon intensity reduction. We also see the mainland's nationally determined contributions by peaking emissions, by lowering carbon intensity, by increasing the share of non-fossil fuel, increase the forest stock volume, and achieving carbon neutrality before 2060. All these kind of considerations are put into our position on how we consider the Hong Kong's climate change policy. So once we know all these kind of background considerations and scientific basis for development, we set up the interdepartmental working group on climate change, because EPD is not responsible for all the developments of buildings, infrastructures, transport, all these kind of things. We need the whole government as a whole to work on different policies and actions to address the climate change issue. So we set up the interdepartmental working group, the IWGCC we call it at that time, that's the first one, so that we could draw different parties to sit together as a meeting panel, so that we could fulfill the SAR's obligations under the UNFCCC as a kind of communication and negotiation platform. We also have this kind of platform to monitor and coordinate actions, how various parties are formulating and carrying out measures in controlling greenhouse gas emissions, and how they facilitate adaptation. It's a kind of communication platforms, rather than me calling different parties, call the department heads to say what are your actions. It's a kind of standing negotiation and discussion platform. And also we have still work on our keep tracking of all those things and monitor closely the latest international developments and circulate those relevant information to other parties, because they are not, I would say, they're not responsible for climate change policies. They may not have the latest information or the channel to get these information. So we are the policy officers to look into these developments and say, if we see the drainage development has kind of new developments in coping with flooding, we could send out information to DSD, Drainage Services Department, and ask them to see if they have any kind of considerations or priorities to address or to come up with new proposals. And also we have the obligations to formulate and coordinate actions to promote public awareness and understanding of this issue. So these are the major functions of this IWGCC, and the various contributions and actions from the bureaus, policy bureaus and departments are under this kind of monitor or discussions or negotiations or keep track of those changes. And then after that, we see that because further to the Hong Kong's Climate Action Plan 2030 and Hong Kong's Climate Action Plan 2050, we upgrade the steering committee. We upgrade the IWGCC into a steering committee. And this one will be chaired by the chief executive. At that time, IWGCC just chaired by our policy bureau's top management, deputy secretaries. Not even the secretaries, just deputy secretaries. So you're not having a very high level of officials to be in charge of all those coordinating actions. But now, with the steering committee, it will be chaired by the chief executives. that can send you orders to do something. So, and also we have the setup of the Office of Climate Change and Carbon Neutrality. So all these are the institutional setup to have a much greater power in a coordinated efforts, in the coordination of efforts in addressing the climate change issue, rather than the Environment and Ecology Bureau. At that time, we called it Environment Bureau to take the lead for addressing climate change. We upgraded to having the chief executives to give or provide the steer or coordination or order or prioritize those actions. And of course, at that time after the climate action plan, we take forward 4 major decarbonization strategies. One is net zero electricity generation. Second is energy saving and green buildings, the green transport and waste reduction. These are the major strategies at the time developed, but it's very similar to all the developments we have assessed. So apart from having the position, having the coordination body, we also at that time did a consultancy studies because it was quite new to develop the climate change policies, having so much information surrounding you. So we have a consultancy studies to provide the basis or assessment to formulate these kind of strategies and recommend to the government what are these strategies and measures for cutting emissions and adapting to climate change. And also we need to prepare all those detailed information as required by the mainland for the meeting the national communications obligations. You have to prepare for that submissions as agreed in the Paris Agreement. So that time the tasks or outcome driven in that study is to cover the review and update of the inventories of greenhouse gas in Hong Kong, because at that time the inventory guidelines was updated. So we have to change it after 10 some years using the old guidelines. So we need to review and update the inventories by reviewing the calculation of the emission inventory. We have to project these emission trends under different scenarios. What are the potential emission cuts? What are the extent of cuts, the penetration of different measures, and project those emission scenarios. And we have to characterize what are those impacts of the climate change in Hong Kong, and then recommend additional policies and measures. Why we say additional policies and measures? Because we have so many policies in place, but haven't put the climate change agenda as a highlight. So we have some kind of measures to put in climate change as an additional element in that considerations, rather than having most of them being new policies or measures. We have many existing policies and measures, but they may be developed for addressing extreme weather. They may be developed or come up with emission cuts of air pollution. But at that time, because climate change is a major focus, so we have to review those measures, whether that would contribute a part to the climate change agenda. And also we need to assess the cost effectiveness of those proposed measures. So having all this kind of background in setting up the platform for negotiations, drawing different bureaus and departments to work together, having the consultancy studies to derive or recommend the policies. The second part is our carbon footprint. So our carbon footprint, we call it, is that it's a kind of greenhouse gas emissions. It will be dependent on your boundary of emission calculations, depending on you calculate the direct or indirect emissions, depending on the time you calculate your emissions, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, or 10 years, the source coverage, and the methodologies. So apart from keep track of all those details that I've mentioned, I also at the time was responsible for compiling the greenhouse gas emissions for Hong Kong. So putting a few tasks together in one position. So what are those inventory guidelines that we can use? The International Inventory Guidelines was published by the IPCC again, the scientific organizations developing this kind of 2006 IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories for us to use. It was updated at that time, so we have to use. We try to review and update according to the latest guidelines. So why we have to use this kind of IPCC guidelines? Again, it's like having different parties or different countries around the world. If you have different methods to calculate emissions, it would be hard to compare, hard to understand, and hard to follow. Just like me when I left the position, if I just have a standard operating procedures or emission calculations methodology Excel put in my hard disk, the next one may not be having the experience and knowledge to understand everything and recalculate the emissions for the year, for the next year, or the year after next. So the IPCC guidelines is to develop or assist countries in calculating the emissions with a complete picture for a national inventory. It produces reliable estimates of emissions and removals of greenhouse gases, regardless of countries' experience or resources. So different countries may have different resources, different data source, different level of details from the emission sectors or sources. So how could we help them to calculate a consistent inventory, not only for the country itself over different years, but also for different countries having a comparison and comparable and compatible with different countries. So the goal is to having a standardized emission calculation methodology based on your level of details available, your expertise, your knowledge, so that when you say we calculate sector A, you are talking about sector A, while at the same time the other countries are talking of the same sector. And comparable, that you can compare emissions from your sector versus the others and your sectors over the years. And also you have a consistent method. So once we change any method in any single year, we have to change the whole series of greenhouse gas emissions. That's why we start emission calculations since 1990. So at that time we have to change 10 some years of emission calculations once we change one method. So there's a lot of work done just by following the guidelines, not to develop the guidelines. So why we have to put in so much effort in compiling the greenhouse gas inventories? We have to determine our carbon footprint. We document our carbon performance over time, or different sectors, or the change over time, keep track of them. We could also characterize our emission sources according to the IPCC sector demarcation. Then we can focus our policies on the priority areas. If you have a big sectors, you have to deal with it. If you have a small sectors, you may just have a lower priority. And also we can set our carbon reduction goals based on your emission calculations in a consistent manner. So which emission sources are covered in the IPCC guidelines? There are just a few volume here. There's 7 volume, but 5 of them, as far as I can remember, are those sector-specific emission calculations. It's a big volume. So energy sector is the major one. It's about the exploration of and exploitation of primary energy sources, like mining or coal mining, gas mining, that kind of thing. We don't have that in Hong Kong. We don't have the drilling for natural gas. We don't have the coal mining here. Conversion of primary energy sources into more usable energy forms in refinery and power, say electricity generation, tar gas production, like by burning coal, burning oil, or burning natural gas. Conversion of one form of energy into another. Tar gas by burning or treating naphtha into a source of energy into your household uses. Transmission and distribution of fuels, like the pipelines for petroleum, that kind of thing. We have the distribution of tar gas, so we have to get an estimate from that. And also the use of fuels in stationary and mobile applications, like the transport sector, that we put gasoline, diesels into your car and use that. So all these are energy sector. The second one is industrial processes and product use, the IPPU. For Hong Kong, as a surface economy, we don't have many industrial sources. The only one is cement production. So we have the cement industry and calculate emission from that cement production process. And also the use of greenhouse gas in products, like the hydrofluorocarbons as alternatives of ozone-depleting substances in the refrigerants. So when we use HFCs as a replacement of the ODS, we have to gauge or estimate the emissions potentially coming from those HFCs leaked into the atmosphere. Those content doesn't have to be accounted, but those emitted or released into the atmosphere, we have to account for those emissions of greenhouse gas from Hong Kong. And also the sulfur hexafluoride that is used in the transformer of the power companies, using at our substations. It's a kind of dielectric chemicals that are used for insulation of the transformers in the substations. So any leakage of sulfur hexafluoride, we have to account for that. So we have to ask for the statistics or the consumption or release of these kind of chemicals from the power companies. This one is much minor. So small in Hong Kong. The agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, what we call the folio. We account for those emissions, removals resulting from carbon stock change in biomass, like cutting down forests. There's a kind of carbon stock change. That organic matter and mineral soils, like the use of these kind of organic matters as a fertilizer in the agricultural field. We don't have many in Hong Kong. The CO2 and non-CO2 from fire on all managed land. It's not natural land. Any managed land, like for forest fire, we have to account for those emissions from the forest fire, but we don't have many in Hong Kong. The N2O emissions from all managed soil, like a deposition of those manure into the land. CO2 emissions associated with liming and urea applications to manage the soil. That's a kind of those kind of fertilizers uses. Methane emissions from livestock. That's the livestock manure treatment, producing not CO2 but methane due to anaerobic digestion. All these kind of additionally generated greenhouse gas emissions from this kind of agricultural activities, but they are so small in Hong Kong. And the last one, major sector in Hong Kong is, that we have to cover. These are the 4 sectors covered in the IPCC guidelines. The last one is waste. When we have solid waste disposal at landfills, we have to account for the emissions. This is, I would say, an interesting story here that if we dump food waste here by aerobic digestions, they would be naturally turning back into CO2 after respiration or degradation. We don't have to account for those emissions because the carbon cycle is completed. But if we dump that into landfill and artificially causing the anaerobic digestions that generates methane, we have to account for those methane leaked into the atmosphere due to those anaerobic digestions, because those emissions should normally assumed to be returned as CO2 due to its biogenic nature. So the food waste dumped into landfills will cause methane emissions. If you don't recover those methane and lead that into the atmosphere, you have to account for this kind of emissions. And calculating the landfill emissions due to those generation minus those recovered are the normally major parts, the methane emissions. And that calculation needs a complicated first-order decay equations, accounting for various kind of food or nature of those waste dumped into the landfill. It takes so long time to explain to bosses what are the first-order decay, what are those emissions generated hypothetically from those equations, and what are the emissions recovered from the landfills. The other way around, once we dump the plastic into landfills, because it won't generate any emission of methane or CO2, there's no emission possible. So that means no emission from plastic dumped into the landfills. Because we are developing the iPark, we will dump the food waste into those incineration. The food waste that we talk about, the methane emissions, would no longer happen because we drive the food waste back into CO2 emissions. And that CO2 emissions is biogenic nature. So once we dump all those food waste into the incinerators and all return to CO2, there's no emissions possible like the landfills. But the plastic that I have talked about, once dumped into the incinerator, will return those fossil nature carbon as CO2. So we need to account for those CO2 emissions from incinerator due to those fossil nature plastic. Sounds a bit complicated. So the landfill emissions is the most complicated emission calculations, or the waste sector is most complicated because of the first order decay and the nature of carbon that embedded into the waste dumped into your facilities. And we have to change the emission calculations according to the latest development in Hong Kong's waste strategy and facility development. That's what I have to explain to bosses. And for second is the biogenic treatment of solid waste, like the anaerobic digestions in the STF. Incineration and open burn is easier to understand because we dump into the incinerator. Once those fossil nature carbon are emitted, you have to calculate. But for those biogenic nature, you don't have to calculate, just like the iPark. And for waste treatment, at the sewage treatment works, you could say it's quite similar that there will be methane emissions due to anaerobic digestions of the waste there. Once you can't recover the waste and they are emitted into the surrounding, you have to account for those methane emissions. So even if you can't recover all the methane, you may just collect them and burn them, just speeding up the conversion of those anthropogenic emissions back to CO2. So there will be no longer the emission calculations for those CO2 emissions. So the key part is that how you calculate is depending on the waste nature, whether it's biogenic nature or anthropogenic nature. What are the conversion process? Whether you're driving it back to the carbon cycle or outside the cycle in coming up with your greenhouse gas emissions. So this is Hong Kong's greenhouse gas emissions over the years since 1990, which is the base year, the starting year of every country most of the time, and up to 2022. There's still the 2023 is yet to come out, and you see that we are having ups and downs. We are in the decreasing trend, but whether we will continue to decrease depends on the major one is the electricity generation and other energy industries. So how could we reduce further in terms of the carbon emissions from electricity generation is the key part. So here is the emission profile of the latest year, 2022. We have 63% of our emissions from electricity generation. We have 19% from transport sector, and the rest would be from waste and others. So, and we estimate along the years that 90% of our electricity uses are from buildings. So it's pretty obvious that we have to deal with electricity, and the second one would be transport. And to deal with electricity, you have to target at buildings. So that's how we look into the emission calculations and put that into the development of the climate change policy. So before I move on to the next part, let's take a break here. Okay, students, let's continue on my talk. So after we talk about our position in terms of the developing the climate change policies, and also we understand the major emission profiles. So we have that kind of scientific basis for evaluating what are the focused areas, what are the potential emission cuts that we could achieve, what are the target emission sources, like electricity and transport. So at that time, we roll out a series of mitigation measures from the consultancy studies, from the development or studies conducted in that consultancy studies as a reference. So first of all, we at that time, as I have talked about, that it's a kind of commitment of a target that we are not allowed, or we cannot just simply say we have an emission cut. We take a similar approach that we target at our emission carbon intensity reduction target. It's a kind of measures of the emissions per GDP. So we would like to achieve a emission per GDP cut by say 50 to 60%. And because of our obligations not to commit any absolute targets, we use the GDP target as our reference for our development of relevant mitigation measures. And we could talk about that per GDP target and come up with the relevant achievement of emissions cuts by saying we can cut our emissions from the 42 million tons in 2005 to around 28 to 34 million tons in 2020. It's a kind of byproduct from that GDP target. So we could come up with a reduction of about 19 to 33%. It's not a commitment of target, it's just a byproduct from the calculations of the per GDP emission reduction. And also we could derive that the per capita emissions will drop from something like 6 tons to 3.6 to 4.5, and means a reduction of 27 to 42%. So in the updated climate action plan 2050, we forecast or project the future targets up to 2035 and 2050s with the figures like 2 to 3 tons at 2035, and then in achieving carbon neutral in Hong Kong in 2050. So you could say that all these are relative targets, not an absolute target of total emission cuts. So first of all, we follow the arrangements and understandings of all those informations for the commitment possible. And then with that in mind, we have the climate action agenda by with the following measures at the time, say with the following maximizing energy efficiencies in particular for buildings, because we know that 60% of that is electricity and 90% are from buildings. We green our road transport. We promote the use of clean fuels for motor vehicles, such as biofuels. We treat the waste by turning waste into energy, so that energy from that waste sector could substitute those energy normally or originally originated from the fossil fuel combustions. So we turn waste into energy, so that cut some of the emissions from fossil fuel sources. And also we propose to revamp the fuel mix, because we know that 60% are from electricity. We want to change the fuel mix by switching to cleaner, low carbon fuel for power generation. So for the energy efficiency part, we would like to maximize the energy efficiency by, say, tightening the building energy cost, because building is one of the major emitters. Buildings are major emitters. We expand the district cooling system or water-cooled air conditioning, because we know that within buildings, air conditioning used most of a large part of the electricity for cooling. So we want to reduce the energy required for cooling by introducing the district cooling system, by introducing the water-cooled air conditioning. And also we would like to reduce the energy demand in new buildings, so that we have better building envelopes to reduce the energy loss and so that the cooling required will be less. And also we would like to improve energy efficiency apart from the energy demand in new buildings. We would like to improve the energy efficiencies in all commercial buildings. That means those existing buildings. And also we would like to expand the scope and tightening the energy efficient electrical appliance standards. So all these are related to the energy users within buildings that we have analyzed in the emission sectors. For greening road transport, at the time, we understand that over 90% of our commuter trips every day are in public transport, because Hong Kong is so small. We have the MTR, we have the public bus system, taxi system. Well, 90% of the commuter trips are on public transport. So we would continue to maintain that high penetration of public transport by building more connections, railways. And we, at that time, widened the use of EFV, environmental friendly vehicles. At that time, we still have so small number of models of EVs. So we would propose using more hybrid vehicles and trial of some electric powered vehicles, like the old private car used by the government here, the MIVAC from Mitsubishi. And at the time, we have thought about implementing the importer's average fleet efficiency standards. That means we would like to control the cars to be imported into Hong Kong with a higher energy efficiency. But that means we will reduce the selection of models for Hong Kong first. And also Hong Kong has no car manufacturing factories here. So we can't just force, say, BMW, Toyota to have a better efficiency just for Hong Kong. If they will consider Hong Kong is so small, being a small part of the world with their car export industry or business. So it's very difficult to implement something for importers to meet, while at the same time we don't have the control. That means we reduce the public options of the selection of car models. So the resistance would expect it to be high, but we tried. Just like EVs, if you have a high tax or high price, you can't just ask them to cut the price. You just provide the tax incentives, so that more EVs could be introduced into Hong Kong, while the public would accept the models available for selection. So it depends on the market demand and supply, while environmental is just one of the considerations. But these are just a sharing of those proposals at that time. And also we promote the use of clean fuel at that time for motor vehicles, because you know that EVs are for private cars or small vehicles, but for big lorries or goods vehicles, we can't just replace them with EVs, because the EV technologies are not so good at the moment, or the models available for selections are so limited. While at the same time, as I talk about the waste problem, if you use diesel from fossil fuel, you have to account for those emissions, because you burn fossil fuels, you have to account for emissions from the burning of fossil fuel in your vehicle. But if I use that use biodiesel, which is a biogenic nature, the carbon are from biogenic nature, we don't have to account for those carbon emissions from these biogenic nature carbon. So if you replace all the diesel with biodiesel, you will just assume there are just so small amount of emissions from diesel emissions from the vehicle because you use all our biogenic nature. So we promote that by having duty-free pure biodiesel. We have the trial scheme in our government vehicles, vessels, and machinery using these biofuel. And we also look into the waste problem by utilizing the waste cooking oils and turn it into biodiesel. So promoting this fuel could serve several purposes. But the key problem here is that if you use biodiesel, the car manufacturers may not guarantee or warranty your vehicle's engine or its machinery because you are using non-diesel fuel in your vehicle that may damage those O-rings or fittings or gears or cause any corrosion to your metals. So it would be quite hard to push for biodiesel users because the consequences of the potential damages to your vehicle is quite uncertain. So we are still waiting. Say if you want to replace those diesel vehicles by other clean fuel, we still need some time for the technology to develop. And say for EVs having such a heavy battery loaded on the goods vehicle is quite infeasible because you will have a much reduced payload for transporting the goods originally designed for this goods vehicle. So we are still waiting for say fuel cell, so that the battery to be carried around on that goods vehicle is much less, while at the same time you can power that vehicle with hydrogen or other alternative clean fuel. But at the same time, there's no more diesel emissions. That's the way to push for replacement of goods vehicle or heavy goods vehicle by other alternative clean fuel, unlike those for the private vehicle fleet. For this one, it's about turning waste into energy as a kind of substitution of the energy sources originated from the power plants by these waste facilities like the T-Park, the I-Park, O-Park. All these are to collect the energy generated from waste, from incineration, from the anaerobic digestion of those methane generated, and use that as a fuel source. And so that the energy replaced will means the electricity sector could have a reduction of the carbon emissions associated with fossil carbon. And also, we have to ask for the full utilization of those recovered landfill gas and the gas generated from wastewater. At the time, we proposed the use of these landfill gases for town gas plant. And the last one is the most controversial one because we target at those 60% of electricity generation by having a proposal for 2020 in the public consultation for revamping change the fuel mix. But at the time when we consolidating views, we note the earthquake and the tsunami hitting the northeastern Japan, and we see different views from the public, how they look into the energy issue, electricity generation issue, nuclear issue. And then after all those development, they have relaunched different consultations on how to take forward the change in fuel mix. If we don't, the fuel mix used for electricity generation, you have to consider several parts. One is the sustainable supply of those fuel for your electricity generation and how it could be securely transported to Hong Kong. And also, because Hong Kong's safety sector for electricity generation is, I could say, as I could remember, is 99.9999% stability. You can't just, they would try to ensure the electricity supply is so secure in Hong Kong from the generation part, from the network, from the grid. So if you have a source from, say, mainland or other places for, say, natural gas, you have to ensure that the fuel supplies, such as the natural gas, must be sustainable, even through extreme weather, typhoons, or whatever. And also, if you have to get a nuclear plant, you have to ensure the secure source of nuclear fuel and also the safety of the nuclear plant. So there are many factors to be considered in our energy team in changing any of the fuel mix while ensuring the high security and reliability of electricity generation in Hong Kong. Because we are, as a service economy, the risk of interrupting our power supply for a minute would be so high, would cost so much. So at that time, we just have to, given the situation, we just put down the proposal and we consider. So even if in the next plan, after I left my position in the Hong Kong's Climate Change Action Plan 2030, we still see quite similar thing by the supply side having reducing the use of coal, increasing the use of gas. We come up with non-fossil fuel source like the nuclear, and within which we see the renewable energy part here. Again, because Hong Kong's geographical size is so small, if you want to have photovoltaic panel, the PV panel, you need to have a very large area, unlike the western part of China. You don't have that much space for you to install so much PV panels. For wind turbine, if you have big wind turbines, you may have to erect them on Hong Kong Island. It's impossible. Over the coastal area, you will affect the ocean-going vessels around Hong Kong. So you don't have much space for installing this kind of thing. So the last thing is to come up with the push for waste to energy. So after all this, at that time when we evaluate, it's about 1 to 2% of renewable energy are from locally produced. And double that would be 3 to 4%. So that's why we have such a small number, because of the constraint of our environment and site constraint. So that's the supply side. For demand side, again, we see that we target the energy saving through different publications, energy intensity reduction, different targets to outperform the building energy costs, ritual commissioning, having green buildings, having audit and energy management opportunities through ritual fitting, building sectors, green procurements, all are quite similar to what I have mentioned in terms of maximizing the energy efficiencies in buildings. So for this part, it's about the transportation. Again, we rely on the rail as the low carbon public transport backbone. We want to control the private car growth. We want to promote walking and cycling. We try to reduce the potential emissions associated with transportations, but the room is not so big because most of the commuters are through public transport. And also the co-benefits would be having less traffic congestions, that kind of things. So we promote the behavioral change most of the time. And also we promote low carbon consumptions, help us to be climate ready. All these more on the push for behavioral change, which would be very difficult for us to gauge the outcome. So there's not much change at that time after all these years because of the limitations in Hong Kong. And also for because we want to draw the attention of the public, we also roll out the public consultations on the climate change at that time. The first one is the Hong Kong's Climate Change Strategy and Action Agenda consultation document. We published this and seek the comments and public opinions. How we charted the way forward for Hong Kong as a low carbon city, come up with their ideas, offer their views, and how we tackle the city's climate change strategies and action agenda for the coming decade. So that's a kind of drawing public's attention on the climate change strategy we have developed. And also for the CDM, as I have talked about in one of the Kyoto mechanisms, we have arranged for such implementations in Hong Kong. While Hong Kong is so small, we can't have so much emissions apart from you cut your emissions in electricity, but we still have the arrangements for the implementation of CDM projects in the Hong Kong SAR. We also roll out this kind of guidelines. We consult the central government that we could implement such thing in Hong Kong's territory and develop the guidelines, that is the measures for operation and management of CDM projects in China. We make reference to those guidelines within the mainland. And also because of the public push for us to allow them to implement their projects in the mainland, we have a much longer negotiations and discussions with the mainland authority so that we could have a supplementary notes on the implementation of projects under CDM by the Hong Kong enterprises on the mainland. So allow them to work or develop their business across the border. But then, as I have talked about that, these are CDM would generate credits, which is a kind of commodity that would be strictly controlled by the mainland. So they have very careful considerations of various issues, because Hong Kong's enterprises could come into the mainland and draw out those credits. So that's why the enterprises were allowed to work on CDMs. As I could remember, it's almost a year later that they could work on CDM within the mainland, rather later than those for them to implement in Hong Kong, because the mainland has to be pretty sure how these credits would go in and out within the mainland. So we have facilitated development, we have the consultations, we have the CDM mechanisms to be followed by the Hong Kong's company working in Hong Kong as well as within the mainland. We also have some kind of voluntary actions for Hong Kong's parties or entities to work on carbon-related things. At that time, it was the first introduction of the carbon audit. I think it's also one of the major parts in terms of the calculations of carbon emissions, like those in ESGs or other green finance. Many people, professors, has asked me about how I derive emissions, and this is the key guideline or guidebook for them to understand how we come up with emissions, rather than their profit and loss or monetary terms. They want to drive a simple emission calculations based on their profit or investment, so that they could draw attention to those bankers or investors that you can come up with a certain kind of money and you drive some kind of emission cuts. But that's impossible because we don't calculate emissions like that. Takes time to explain, but they accept. This is kind of guidelines we developed at the time, so that the general public or non-professional emission compiler has to know how to calculate their emissions. So once you calculate, you understand, you have the background of the carbon audit. You know that we want to have the carbon audit to promote that you understand more of your carbon footprint, identify your appropriate actions and measures for reduction for an organization, for a company, for a business, that kind of thing. And because we have a standard guidelines from EPD, you know that you're following something that would be authoritative. And so you can calculate your emissions and compare with others, and you can demonstrate how you emit in your business and demonstrate your leadership in the sector. So I've briefly mentioned what's the carbon audit. It's designed for voluntary. It's not compulsory for me as the authority to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. It's a kind of voluntary and self-reporting guidelines. You make reference to well-established protocols like the greenhouse gas protocol, or more or less the same like the IPCC, but less complex, more simplified. And you have to follow the ISO standards, mostly accepted or recognized by the business sector. And the carbon audit provides the guidelines for the company or business to report your emissions according to your determine your physical boundaries and identify your operations for the reporting purpose and how you calculate emissions. Say here is it covers scope 1 operations, like those direct emissions and removals, like electricity generators that you use fuel to generate emissions, generate electricity. You have to account for those fuel used, boilers, gas stoves, dedicated motor, feed leakage, or your refrigerant systems. That's those use the fuel and the emissions associated. That's the scope 1 operations and the emissions. Scope 2 operations are energy related indirect emissions. That means how you produce, transport of the electricity and town gas purchased by the buildings. So these are the use of energy source, and you calculate the indirect emissions generated from the power plant or generated from town gas plant. So that's how you calculate scope 2 operations. And for scope 3 operations, it's much more harder to calculate. Are those indirect emissions like business travel, transportation of products, materials, and people and waste by third parties, like contractors sending you the products or raw materials, and how you calculate those indirect emissions. It's quite similar to life cycle analysis, that you calculate emissions associated with third-party operations. And the carbon audit guide also sets out the local conversion factors for estimating greenhouse gas emissions of some common operations. For infantry compilers, we have so many detailed emission factors for various facilities, units, emission sources, engines, all these things. But we can't list out all those emission factors for you to calculate. So we generalize these factors, while at the same time make reference to the local factors as a generalization of the local factors for you to calculate, so that you can have simple calculations, while at the same time you are similar to local situation, rather than using a default values from US or from Europe. So these are the sample, say the stationary emission calculations. We list out the tables for you to come up with a description on the fuel use, amount, and lead you through the process, similar to my calculation of emission infantry. what are the fuel use amounts and units, what are the fuel types, and then the emission factors from CO2, methane, N2O, because greenhouse gas is not just CO2. So yeah, we will let you have all the emission factors for various key greenhouse gas. And then you can simply calculate from that table and sum them up together to get your emissions. This is another table about the mobile source emissions, like the vehicle. So you can see the road transport, the ship emissions, aviation emissions. If you have those information, you have the fuel information, then you can calculate the CO2, methane, and N2O emissions again. And also we produce these kind of stationary source emission factors. Like the use of LPG, you have the emission factors of CO2 as 3.017 kilogram per kilogram of LPG used. For town gas, you have 2.549 kg per unit of town gas used. And apart from CO2, you have the methane emissions. So for every unit of town gas used, you have 0.0446 gram of methane. And similar to N2O, that's what we produce, the generalized factors for you to calculate the local relevant emissions. And for mobile source, you have the CO2 emissions for different fuel type. And also you have the methane emission factors for various vehicle type, like a motor vehicle, passenger car, light bus, light goods vehicle. You see, if you use light goods vehicle using ultra low unleaded petrol, you have 0.203 gram per liter of methane. But if you use diesel, you have 0.072 gram per liter of methane. So all these factors are produced or referenced in the guidelines for you to calculate. And I think all these are the facilitation, or you could say, is the carbon calculators for any people, anybody who has the interest to calculate the emissions, no matter it's for carbon audit, no matter it's for ESG or green finance or the related emissions, they should reference to something like that. And all these are related to activities, not money of your activities. So that's a kind of we are still on the way to push for the qualified carbon emission calculations, because you say you have many cases showing ESG, but you may not be able to see what kind of emissions they are calculating. So this is the good reference, and that's what we use for the carbon audit. And it would be so much more complex in the greenhouse gas inventory system. And that's how we derive emissions from the authoritative IPCC source. So apart from having the calculators and the carbon audit guidelines, we promote that through, say, ceremony, launching this kind of audit. And also we push for the use of this carbon audit by having the building energy efficiency funding schemes at the time, so that we subsidize the building owners to conduct these energy carbon audits. And from that emissions they calculate, they could come up with kind of proposals on what are the emissions possible to be cut from their buildings, and so that they could apply for another funding, the energy efficiency project for their buildings. But it's a kind of incentives to promote your understanding of carbon emissions, and also promote the retrofitting, so that the carbon emissions on energy uses would be reduced from your buildings, because 90% of the electricity is from buildings. So we want to voluntarily encourage owners to put in the resources to do this, to check your emission and improve the emission performance. But we know from building owners and the property managers that all these kind of incentive schemes would need the owners or property managers to put in money, resources, while at the same time would benefit those renting their units. Because if you say you have low energy, those using the units will only need to pay less in their electricity bill. So they some kind of having a quite reluctant at that time to use that. But on the other side of the story is that if you have good energy efficiency labels of your buildings, you would attract more tenants to come to your buildings because of the energy performance. So you could charge more. So it depends on the market drivers in terms of promoting energy efficiencies and carbon audits. That's what we heard of in the discussions. And also because of the carbon audit thing is so important to give you a clear and accurate picture of your carbon emissions, we also prepare for the professional development of these carbon audit services, just like the Hawker system for laboratories. We accredit services so that we have bodies that could validate or verify these carbon emission calculations. It's a kind of promoting quality carbon audit. So after talking about these mitigation measures to be developed by government, to be voluntarily adopted by the business or building owners, the fourth part is on our adaptation options. This part is quite different versus the mitigation measures. We call it as options because all these options, your adaptation to climate change depends on your ability to adapt, your resources that could be allocated to adapt, and your priorities. So at that time when we work on the consultancy studies, we could only give out options for different parties to consider. We cannot force them to say you adapt to climate change by 1, 2, 3, 4. We just lay out all the options so that you could choose what you want to implement. Depends on your priority. So we at that time adopt the word as adaptation options. So it's an optional selection for you to choose. But at least you have to first understand what are the vulnerability. That's the first new concept at the time, because we always talk about cutting emissions. We never talk about vulnerability to climate change. In the previous consultancy studies on climate change, we never talk about our vulnerability. We only talk about cutting emissions. What are the cuts? What are the possible cuts? We did not talk about vulnerability. And this was the first consultancy studies to evaluate the risk, climate risk, because we need to gauge the degree to which our system could cope with climate change, or how it would be having the risk of impact by climate change. And it will depends on how likely that impacts will come up. What are the importance? Different people has different values. You consider some kind of mangrove would be important. We could consider some butterflies would be important. Depends on how you see the importance of that system, so that we could put in the resources to cope with the climate change. And what are the potential for adaptation? Could you move those butterflies from one place to another? What are the potential adaptation options possible? So at that time, with the limited information and the first trial of the vulnerability assessment, we see 8 key vulnerable areas. We see biodiversity and natural conservation, built environment and infrastructure, business and industry, energy supply, financial services, food resources, human health and water resources as the 8 key vulnerable areas. So we derive the vulnerable areas first, and then we see the details here, like biodiversity due to greater stress to the ecosystem. For built environment, there may be damage to buildings. For business, there may be interruption or maintenance or insurance. For energy supply, there may be damage to power lines or power interruptions. For financial services, there may be a direct or indirect risk due to telecommunication or computer system breakdown. For food resources, because most of food are import, there may be less availability of local or regional food supply. For human health, we do not know the chronic or risk of thermal threat, that kind of things. And for water resources, similar to food resources, we are quite reliant on the import of water from Dongjiang. So we will, if we see any change in rainfall pattern, there may be rising demand of water supply. But at the same time, there may be other areas having this kind of high demand of water. So there may be a problem for supply of water to Hong Kong at that time. So all these are kind of major impacts as evaluated in that first vulnerability assessment. And as I have talked about, the options available would be on the understanding that the effects of climate change are inevitable. So climate is changing. It's changing all the time. And also risk can be cushioned by adaptive actions, say reducing the risk, reducing the potential for adverse impacts, enhancing the resilience in response to observed or projected changes in climate. And IPCC also talk about this vulnerability and adaptations and identified that there may be a reduction of the exposure to the climate risk. There may be a reduction of the sensitivity of the system to the climate impacts, or we may build intrinsic adaptive capacity by raising public awareness and education. So we follow these kind of directions and give the following outcomes from the consultancy studies. So the framework covers several areas. The first one is the monitoring part. So we may need to continue the monitoring of the system so that we could have the significant adaptive capacity, keep it ongoing to monitor the increase or decrease in risk. Like extreme temperatures, we have more planning suggestions and guidelines for our works departments to develop their projects. For drought, we may have a water management program. For floods, we may have more rainstorm warnings and flood prevention projects. So we will have the continued vigilance in light of the potential new challenges in the future. The second framework is on the institutional strengthening and capacity building. So as I've talked about the IWGCC and steering committee, that kind of systems, we may need to strengthen the connections between different bureaus and departments and parties so that actions that can facilitate adaptations may be embedded into different bodies responsible for different areas of Hong Kong, strengthening the existing and future infrastructures. The third one is about the disaster management and emergency planning. It's easy to understand. So we have the advanced planning to respond to events such as climate-related events or typhoons or extreme events, so that the management and emergency planning could be prepared upfront. The fourth one is about R&D, research and investigation. So we note the high uncertainty in the assessment that many data are not available for the assessment. So we need to understand more about the impact, the change in environment, and the extreme events. And also we note the data gaps, and we want the relevant departments to collect more data to fill the data gaps, and so that it could address the uncertainty in the local environment, so that we know more about the impacts before we could come up with future adaptation strategies. And the last one is about the education and public awareness. It's always the case that because adaptation was a new concept at the time, we need to share information and knowledge about what adaptations are. What are those adaptation strategies available for our departments and various bureaus to understand and come up with the agenda for future plans and projects. So we not only enhance awareness through public education and participation, we also roll out programs to share for capacity building of different government departments. So these are the major frameworks. Here are some of the examples how the options are put in place to adapt to climate impacts, build resilience to climate impacts. Like the built environment infrastructures, we have asked advised the CEDD to have review the coastal structure design, or having the landslide prevention protocol upgrade. So it's a kind of promotion of the awareness, while at the same time they understand they must do something to review their work and plans, guidance, or all these codes in their original area of work. So the climate change agenda helps them to improve their understanding of the tasks of their activities, of their work. The other one is about the reviewing of the drainage master plan because of the flooding issue. Drainage Services Department has to build more flood risk maps, identify the drainage infrastructure at risk, and formulate necessary improvement measures. Like this one, the Happy Valley Underground Stormwater Storage Scheme, to cope with the extreme rainfall events and flooding. For the financial sectors, we have engaged and partnering with business sectors to get them prepared for the climate risk. Because say if the interruption of the business, interruption of the supply chain, they will be charged for high insurance. They may have to compensate for have a big loss for their business. So we need to engage them for the business sector to be aware of the climate risk and also prepare for relevant insurance. For water resources, we have to ensure the reliable water supply. So the Water Supplies Department has developed the total water management strategy, management for the water's demand and supply in a sustainable manner, upgrade, keep track of the changes over time, and develop further strategies to deal with this demand supply of water in Hong Kong. For climate monitoring, we will expect the Hong Kong observers to do their work so that they could monitor the climate in Hong Kong. They are the authority and has the expertise and scientific system to monitor the climate system in Hong Kong, and could provide a range of climate information for planning, for building infrastructure design. And they also upgrade their modeling and simulations according to the latest IPCC finding and projections. Say for the sea level rise, they have to downscale the projections of that global model down to the small scale of Hong Kong's territory to understand the changes anticipated from their projections, and provide information to say our drainage department or for other buildings department into that design to cope with the anticipated or projected changes. So these are also the follow-up work on adaptation. Because I have highlighted the lack of data in the first assessment, and also we know the micro-scale climate forecast is not that accurate at that time, and also we are not quite sure on the cost implications. We cannot. Some of the departments told us that we cannot build a wall for prevention of flooding by saying 1 meter or 2 meter if you don't have the information. So, and the cost for 1 meter versus 2 meter is not double. So all this kind of lack of information would lead to a high uncertainty in getting the resources and the plan, a secure plan to work on the climate-related issues. So we are asking for relevant departments to understand there will be some kind of big uncertainty in the assessment at this stage. And also, if any department would like to implement the suggested adaptation options, they have to have a careful planning of what they would take forward of those anticipated changes in the future and the additional costs incurred into the implementation and evaluate the implications. So that's the limitation in terms of the development of the adaptation strategy at that time. And also in the Climate Action Plan 2030 later, still the focus is on the slope safety, water security, and coastal protection. It's quite similar to the first stage adaptations strategy developed. So the last part of the policy is on awareness raising. We have talked about cutting emissions, documenting our footprint, checking our positions, adaptation options. The last part is on awareness raising. We roll out capacity building workshops so as to get the relevant departments on board, understand the impacts, understand the recommended options, adaptation options and measures relevant to their area so that they could take forward the issues, having more studies, having more experience to implement or develop their adaptation measures. And they could also, based on their understandings and knowledge, identify and prioritize their actions, reviewing their practice, reviewing their guidelines, expertise, and knowledge gaps. So all these are knowledge for bureaus, departments, and professionals within Hong Kong's government. The other part is that we have the Hong Kong Guangdong Joint Liaison Group on combating climate change. We have to share information and knowledge and exchange with other parts across the border. So we have this kind of setup so that there would be a kind of communication channel for the cooperation between the Guangdong and Hong Kong parties. This is kind of set up under here. The setup is to cooperate on combating climate change, coordinate relevant measures and activities, and also promote related scientific research and technology development. This kind of communication platform and sharing platform. And the work of this JLGCC is mentioned here is about information exchange, having seminars to be held in Hong Kong on climate adaptation. So it's a kind of information sharing again. And also seminar on renewable energy and EVs. All these kind of activities are more related to information sharing first because climate change is quite a new agenda at that time. So we need to work with partners on how we take forward the actions. And also, while we have kickstarted the communication channel in terms of the climate change issues, we also set up the JWG EPCCC, the Hong Kong Guangdong Joint Working Group on Environmental Protection and Combating Climate Change. We put environmental protection and climate change agenda together so that the original joint working group merged together and formed this platform. So it's a kind of another communication channel to share information in terms of not only on climate change, but also on environmental protection grounds, different aspects. And climate change collaboration in this JWG EPCCC is to continue to promote and deepen exchanges and cooperations on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience on climate change. So it's a kind of external communication channels across the border. So that's the setup here. And the last meeting is December 2023, the fourth meeting. And the next one is on 28th this month. And I have to join because we have to talk about other related VOC monitoring, that kind of things in this platform. So environmental protection versus as well as climate change will be presented in this platform here. So that's how the how I would like to share with students how we look into the climate change issues in terms of the scientific aspect, in terms of the local constraint, international constraints, the mainland's considerations, obligations, the understanding of what we have here, and the projections, and what are the considerations in terms of rolling out different strategies, so that you can put together of your learned information and details from the web, from your teacher, from other areas, and put it into the government's policy and how we put it into the radar in the development. Hope you can learn something from this, and this is the end of my sharing. Thank you. Before I end for the question and answer, anyone here about HKIQEP? Because I understand that you are from environmental protection field, and we have recently, I'm involved as the facilitator for HK Hong Kong Institute of Qualified Environmental Professionals. Just like the Hong Kong IE, the HKIQEP is now a statutory body providing the qualification and career path for professionals in the environmental protection field. And if any students having the interest or having the focus in working in the environmental protection field in the future, I think the qualifications will help you understand what are the requirements and the demand of this qualification when you work in this field in the future. So you will have to get a sense of what this is about, just like the engineers working in the department, having the chartership to work in the engineering field. For environmental protection professionals, if they want to pursue further in the field, they have to at least have an understanding of this qualification. And the government will likely require anything like the engineering field professionals that this kind of qualification may be required in the future. So given the chance, and I'm involved in this HAIQEP as in the General Council and working in this private member bill, I would like to share with you this additional information because the CAP 1183 has been released. So this is a kind of statutory body having the equivalent status as the Hong Kong Institutes of Engineers, Hong Kong Institutes of Planners, Architects, that kind of professional institutes that will appear in your career path more frequent in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vincent. So if no question, we may end the class here. And from next week, we will have 2 classes for the report. So I think so far the teaching assistant may haven't sent you the list for the presentation. So in general, we are all required to attend the class, the next presentation class. So the list will be distributed to you before the class. Okay. Okay, thank you. We will upload the teaching material to the system.